All right, so we welcome colleagues from around the world. We have people here from the UK, including England, Scotland and Wales, from Ireland, from South Africa, China, Australia, New Zealand, and also from Canada. So you're very welcome to this IFNTF seminar. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Nigel Francis, and he's from Cardiff University here in the UK. And Dr. Francis' talk is entitled Engaging Students with the Feedback Process. So over to you, Nigel.
Perfect. Thanks, Martina, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you today. So hopefully, while you've been waiting and during that introduction, you've had an opportunity to just go on to the Mentimeter poll and answer the question about how long students expect to wait for their feedback. And I'll come back to that a little bit later on in the talk. But really, the talk divided into two parts, and it was really a project I started when I was at Swansea University about trying to get students to engage more with their feedback in an effort to improve the NSS score, as we all are trying to do, but also to try and engage students more with their feedback so they got more out of the process as well. So what I often see when we see talks about feedback, this quote from Hattie and Timbley, is that feedback is one of the most powerful influences on learning and achievement. But perhaps what a lot of people don't know is that the second part of that quote is, but this impact can either be positive or negative. And so it's really important that we try and get this feedback process right in order that the students benefit the most from it. And we've seen quite a lot of information that's come out, and I've shamelessly plagiarized this idea from Naomi Winston, who came to Cardiff a couple of weeks ago to give a talk. And she talked about this old paradigm feedback of sending feedback comments out into the virtual learning environment and hoping that they land in somewhere and that students can actually do something with them. And it's really about that sort of trying to shift that narrative so that rather than feedback just being something that's done to the student, that it's an active process that they have to engage with. And that's really what we were trying to do with both of the interventions I'm going to be talking about here today. So a lot of the things that the students are really querying about are things like, when will I get my feedback? They're always really anxious about how long it will take for them to get their feedback after they submitted their work. Quite often they don't know where to go on the virtual learning environment or within different platforms to actually find their feedback, so they can't engage with it that way because they don't know where to get it. And then when they do get their feedback, they've often got questions about what does that feedback mean? So how do I use it to actually improve? And, you know, how do I take the comments that an academic has left and use that in order to become a better student? And really what we're trying to do with both of these interventions, and everybody who's working in this field, is to try and disentangle this ball of sort of confusion that the students have, and we get this sort of more linear process that hopefully the students become more proficient at using their feedback, or feedback literate, as it's been termed. And so the first of the interventions that I ran was a whole series of feedback workshops, which was really about trying to help students to identify the link between the comments that they got on their work from academics and how they could then use that moving forward. And this was based around the DEFT toolkit, which Naomi Winston and Rob Nash produced for Advanced HE. And it's a series of resources that you can use in an interactive workshop. And so what I did was I adapted some of these resources. We had it in sort of small group tutorials, and I got a load of postgraduate students to come in and help me run that, so that they had the student voice as well as students who had just graduated and were now doing either a master's or a PhD, and their perception on where they got feedback from, how they used it, that sort of thing. So it's a really interactive workshop, and the QR code there will take you to those resources. I'll drop those in the links into the chat, or ask Martina to circulate them after the talk. But the question I asked you with that Mentimeter code was, how long do you think students actually expect to wait for their feedback? And this was a poll that was given to first-year students in the second week of their first term at university. And so what we're seeing here is actually it's quite a nice split. So some people think it's a sort of, you know, very short turnaround of about 1 to 3 days. Some people are sort of thinking the students will be a little bit more patient at about 12%. But the overwhelming is sort of around that 2 to 3 week mark. And if you actually ask the students what they think of this, then you'll get a very similar kind of response. So a lot more students think that they're going to get feedback within 1 to 3 days. Quite a lot think that it's going to be within about a week or 2 weeks. And then less students are thinking more along that sort of 3 weeks to 4 week sort of period. And I think a lot of the initial dialogue that we need to have with students is about managing expectations. If you have a class of 200 students, it's not going to be realistic to be able to provide marks and feedback within 1 to 3 days. And perhaps they've got that expectation from school when they're in a smaller class and teachers are able to start to turn around the work within that sort of couple of day period. And so having that dialogue with the students and actually explaining what happens once a piece of work is submitted, the process it has to go through in order to reach the marker, and then how that marker has to balance actually marking that work with all of the other academic responsibilities they have, is probably something that's really important for the students to understand right from the start. And when we ran the poll at the end of this session, that whole sort of shift had moved up to that sort of 2 to 3 week period, so that expectations of students can be managed and tempered. I wonder if the big things is whether or not students understand what feedback is for. And quite often you go to talks about this and people say, well, the students don't know what to do with the feedback. And if you talk to individual students, that might be quite true, but as a collective, quite a lot of the students have got a really good idea, and that really varies from quite a sort of a simplistic idea really up to some quite complex ideas. So at a very basic level, they'll say things like, it's to improve the quality of my work. Then they may go on, it's a constructive criticism that I'm using to improve the work. But then you get people who are a little bit more articulate with it about reflecting on their work, about identifying progression through the course rather than on an individual piece of work, which it starts to imply using the feedback to improve throughout the duration of a course. And then you get some quite really nice ones about sort of promoting personal, professional growth as well, which is quite a sort of a deep introspective perception of what feedback can be used for. And so I don't think it's necessarily true that we can say that students don't know what feedback is for. I think they have an idea about what feedback is meant to be used for. I think the challenge is actually getting the students to use the feedback and understand how to use the feedback effectively, rather than them not knowing what to do with it in the first place. Again, Naomi shared this as a very similar cartoon to this about the fact that students don't want to hear unpleasant truths. They want to have their egos massaged and told what they've done well. And so one of the things that I do right at the start of the feedback workshop is provide some feedback I was given on the grant application. And I was particularly upset by this quote because the entire premise of the grant funding call was to get new immunologists who had no background in cancer immunology to come into the cancer field and to bring new ideas to it. And I was actually on holiday at my sister's wedding when the feedback for this came through. And so it wasn't exactly a great experience for me. And to be able to share that with the students and say, you know, this really impacted me, this really upset me. I think that's important, that they understand that we still get upset by the feedback that we receive sometimes from journal reviewers. And we need to park that. And we need to come back to it when we're in the right frame of mind as well. So sharing ideas with our colleagues and with our students is really important. When you ask the students to start identifying some of the barriers about using feedback, one of the most common things that came back was, I just want to know what I'm good at. What have I done well? And that's quite a naive view about the feedback process, in terms of, if you only look at what you've done well, you're not going to improve, because it's not the things that you're doing well that you need to keep getting better at. It's those things that you're not doing so well that need to be improved, and you need to maintain and enhance the things you are already doing well. But a lot of those barriers sort of come down to motivation and confidence. So if they haven't got a mark, or the feedback is more critical than their friends has got, they can become quite demotivated by the feedback process, and they may not want to engage with it. They haven't got that motivation in terms of wanting to go in, read the feedbacks and actually process that. But this last quote I saw on the right here, so like, may not have enough time to read, understand and improve on all of the aspects of the feedback received, really resonated with me, because we spend an enormous amount of time giving very detailed feedback. And I'm sure in many institutions, as with mine, you'll go in and look at how many students have accessed that feedback afterwards, and it's rarely above 40–50% of the students. So we spend a lot of time providing feedback comments for students, and then they don't get accessed and they don't get acted on. But perhaps the students are feeling overwhelmed by that. So there's an element there of there's too much feedback. And if we can actually tailor the feedback a little bit more to what the students need and want, perhaps we can encourage those students to actually engage with that feedback process a little bit more. So in terms of those barriers and how do we break those barriers down, one of the quotes was from the students that they wanted that feedback to be more specific on the areas that they needed. And that's very hard because you've got to then ask the students what they want. And so one of the ways that you could possibly do that is with interactive cover sheets, where you're actually getting the students to say, okay, so what feedback do you want on this piece of work? How can I help you? It's also about then getting into that mindset of not being afraid to fail, of being in the right mindset then of being able to consider and accept constructive criticism, and identifying that the marker isn't trying to criticize you, they're trying to help you, they're trying to encourage you to become a better student and more rounded. And I think what was quite interesting was that one of the quotes there was about working as a peer group and being able to discuss with the peers whether or not they understood what that feedback meant. If they didn't, being able to clarify that either with themselves or with the marker. And so perhaps one thing we ought to be doing is to building in feedback sessions into our teaching, where the students have actually got a timetable space where they can go and consider the feedback they've got, not just perhaps for an individual piece of work, but for multiple pieces of work that they're getting back at a similar time. And so they can actually start to process and understand what that feedback means and how they can use it. So when I asked the students what the most beneficial part of the workshop was, the overwhelming response was about the graduate students, that they had come in, that they'd shared their views, that they were willing to pass on their advice of what had worked for them. And they were quite open with their views. They were critical of staff if they hadn't done things well. And I think that was really important because you've got to have that honest dialogue with the students. I think that sort of over 40% of the comments that were made were about student partners. If you ever needed evidence that co-creation with students and getting students involved in these kinds of processes is a good thing, then that's your take-home message from that, is that the students are really important in engaging the newer students in this process and helping them to understand what they need to do. So when COVID hit, the 4 students had been in live workshops very graciously gave up one of their evenings and helped me create a series of 4 videos, which you can access from either the QR code or that the tiny URL link. The students have given permission for these to be used. So if you do want to use these in your teaching, then please feel free to use any of these resources. But basically, I was asking them questions about sort of how did your perception of feedback change, and what would you think the purpose of feedback was during your course, barriers that they had to actually acting on their feedback, where they got it from, and why they thought it was important they acted. There's a whole series of each video is about sort of 5 minutes or so long, with 4 students giving their perceptions. And those have been really important in allowing these workshops to become a more sort of flipped process, whereby the students can engage with some of the material before they come to the workshop. So if you ask the students whether they find this useful as a process, then a vast majority, so over 80% of them, either rated it as a 4 or 5. So it looks as though students really do take something from these workshops, that they are valuable. I think getting them and doing this right at the start of the academic journey with them is really important to get them into the right frame of mind for engaging with their feedback throughout the course. So in terms of the conclusions for this particular intervention, I think that students by and large understand what feedback should be used for. But I think the challenge is that they don't really necessarily understand what the comments mean and how they can use them, and that they do have egos. And as an 18 or 19-year-old child, they are fragile egos, and we need to be nurturing and encouraging those students. And sometimes if the criticisms come across as quite harsh to those individuals, then that will put them off from engaging with feedback even more. So I think we've got a duty really right from the start to make this feedback as encouraging and as actionable as we possibly can, but also useful to the students. And I think that's something that we'll talk about in the second part of this talk. If we could get students working as a peer group, I think they've got a really good way of overcoming the barriers that are associated with feedback literacy and not understanding what comments mean. Having access to a member of staff during a taught timetable session, being able to discuss feedback with their friends and their peers in a safe environment, they can probably overcome most of the barriers that are associated with the feedback literacy, and we can sort of help train them to do that. I think the most important thing from this bit was about the student partners, about their perspective, and how they changed as they moved through their course in terms of being able to convey that message. So the second part is an intervention I ran with some second-year students, and I've entitled this Flipped Feedback, engaging students with their feedback, because it's trying to turn the feedback process on its head and make sure that the students really got somewhere for the feedback to land. So the background to the intervention was that it was a second year module, and it followed a typical split at Swansea at the time, which was 75% of the module was based on an exam and 25% was based on coursework. That coursework comprised 2 different lab reports. And the reason I targeted this module was twofold. It was quite a low number of students. It's about 50 to 60 students a year that I ran out. So it was a manageable number. But also because the 5-year average for the module had been around about sort of the 52, 53% mark, which was quite a lot lower than the rest of the modules in that year. So I wanted to try and see whether I could help the students to improve the coursework marks within that module. So what was the big issue with this module? Well, the main thing was the timeline. So this was taught in the 2nd semester, and we had 5-week teaching blocks. And normally this module would be punctuated by Easter. So you'd either have 4 weeks of teaching and then an Easter break for 3 weeks, come back for 1 week of teaching, or it would be 3 weeks of teaching before Easter and 2 weeks after Easter. And the practicals were held in the first 2 weeks of the teaching block, which in and of itself was a bit of a problem because the student hadn't covered a lot of the content in lectures anyway by that point. But then they had 2 hand-ins, so they had 2 weeks to write up each of the practical reports. And in this particular year that I decided to run the intervention, that would have meant that they would have handed in the 2nd lab report immediately before going home for the Easter vacation and switching off for 3 weeks. And Swansea had a policy where they would not release marks or feedback during Easter holidays. So this feedback that the students would have received would have been released on the Monday when they came back from Easter. They've got 1 week of teaching and they go straight into exam prep. And so there's nowhere for them to use that feedback that they're going to receive. So they're going to get 2 lots of feedback on 2 practicals and forget about it. And they're not going to then do another lab report until they get into their final year and they're writing out their final year project, by which time they'd probably forgotten about much of the feedback that they got from this module anyway. So what we tried to do was to come up with an idea about how we could help them that. And I think the thing that really struck me was that the students really did enjoy the practicals. They thought it was one of the best parts of the module, but they weren't getting good marks in it. And so I really wanted to try and help them with that. So the labs were stimulating, they were fun, they were the best part of the module, they were effective, but there was also quite a lot of confusion with what they were actually being asked to do within these modules. So if those students, we ran a biochemistry and a genetics course, and this was entitled clinical biochemistry. So it was very much aimed at the biochemists on the course, but some geneticists did decide to take it and they found it a lot more challenging. So they found it a lot more confusing. They also weren't always clear on what we were asking them to do in terms of the lab report. It was a bit more of a structured report, it was confusing. But then this last quote about them not receiving their marks and their feedback 4 weeks after the hand-in was what really prompted me to try and make this intervention work. Because I had released generic feedback immediately after they had handed in those lab reports, and they didn't realize that that generic feedback was a form of feedback to them. They focus very much on the marks and the individualized comments that they get. And because of that Easter vacation, we weren't able to provide that within the normal 3-week time frame. So my idea really was to provide generic feedback on a draft submission and then to get the students to improve that draft and resubmit. And fortunately, during the summer after that, I decided I was going to do this intervention. I read the book that Naomi Winston and David Carlos wrote about improving feedback in higher education. And I started to refine that idea. And I came up with this concept of flipping the feedback. And although there is an element of draft and improvement, it's a bit more of an in-depth process for the students, which hopefully will make it a bit more engaging for them. So in terms of flipping the feedback, it was generic feedback provided on a draft report, but that was the only feedback that they got on that draft submission. And based on that, I asked the students to complete a self-assessment of which elements of the mark scheme they thought they had satisfied. And I got them to do that on a Likert scale of 1 to 5 from I haven't done this at all the way up to I've done this perfectly. And to start to think about how they had evidenced in their report the elements of the marking criteria. Based on that, I got them to predict their mark. And so I asked them what mark they thought they deserved for their piece of work. based on that self-assessment and whether they thought they'd satisfied different elements of the marking criteria. And then to provide a reflective evaluation of their performance, that they had to almost write the sort of the critique to their performance within that. And then to request 1 or 2 really specific pieces of feedback on their report. So things that they didn't understand or didn't know that they had done wrong or wanted further explanation on. And that was the only feedback they then got on the final report. So they submitted their report. They had a week to do the draft. They submitted that draft, and that generic feedback was released the day that that draft was submitted. And they then had a further week to refine that draft and carry out this self-assessment and reflection, and to submit the final project report, which was then marked. The incentive for them to actually engage with this process was that the draft was worth 64% and the final report was worth 36%. And we chose on those percentages working with a statistician, because we worked out that that allowed students across the mark range to make a significant improvement if they engage with this process. And you do see a greater improvement, obviously, in some of the weaker students who have engaged with it compared to those at the top end who have already done quite a good job of the draft. But you still get significant improvements in those students at the top end. The idea behind predicting the mark was I wanted them to take it seriously. I didn't want them just to say that they thought they had 100%. So I said that if they were within 5% of the marks I gave them and their mark was higher, then they would win. So if I marked it at 60 and they said that they were at 65, they would get the 65. And realistically, over the course of the entire module, that meant that even if they picked up both of the two 5% incentives, they would get an extra 2.5% on the final module mark. So it wasn't a huge amount in terms of the actual module contribution, but it did provide them with a reason for taking this serious and for really thinking about what they thought their mark was within a reasonable kind of range. So the question is whether it worked or not. And so we sort of looked at sort of the previous couple of years before we'd done this, where they had just submitted a final report versus the work where they'd had this flipped feedback approach. And you can see that there's quite a highly significant increase in the overall marks for most of the reports across the 2 years. And I wanted to delve into this a little bit deeper just to sort of see what the students were actually achieving in terms of their improvement. And it actually turned up something quite really interesting, is that although both of the reports were improved quite significantly, there wasn't as much of an improvement in the second report as I thought there might be. And when we were talking to the students about this, we were asking about whether or not they had taken the information that they'd been given from the first report and they were able to apply it to the second report, because they follow very similar formats. They're both lab reports, they're both quite structured. And I expected that those students that had engaged with the process would improve the second report by a greater degree. But we didn't see that. We actually saw the opposite, and there was actually a smaller increase in that second report, which is really interesting and something that we need to try and delve into and really understand. But importantly, over 80% of the students improved their mark for both of the practical reports. Importantly, none of the students got a worse mark. And the sort of like 20-odd% that didn't improve just resubmitted the same piece of work. So they didn't engage with the process at all. So they took their draft and they just resubmitted it as their final piece of work. And so they got the same mark for both pieces of work. We saw a 9% increase in the first mark, in the first practical, and a range between 0 and 31%. And then the second practical, like I said, was only a 6% increase, but the range was slightly bigger. So we did see some students who improved more within that. That was really highly significant. So the change was really significant educationally. But there was this weak correlation between the hemoglobin and the glucose plaque, so the first and the second. And like I said, that really implies that the students weren't able to take the generic feedback and their reflection on the first piece of work and apply it to the second piece of work, which I found quite interesting. That's actually, if you look at the very last comment here, in terms of the students, they felt that they were able to take that feedback and apply it. So they really strongly agree that they have taken what they've done and applied it to other tasks. And that's certainly not what we're seeing in terms of that second report improving by similar or greater amount. But they did find it useful. And so they did think it was a useful process. They did think that the generic comments allowed them to enhance their marks. And And what was quite interesting, though, was even though they saw the benefits of this, when you asked them, would you just prefer to have one report marked, there was a really sort of polarized Marmite-like effect. As some students were like, yes, I really want just one piece of work. And others were like, no, I really like this process. So although they see the benefits of what they're doing, that doesn't necessarily then translate to them wanting more of that, which I found really confusing. And so I really wanted to try and delve down into that a little bit deeper, but unfortunately COVID hit and we weren't really able to engage with the students as much as perhaps we would have liked. The students did comment on the end of module that they did enjoy this process. So the fact that they were able to improve the draft and to show what they had learned, how they applied it, that the self-assessment allowed them to work out where they had made mistakes, and that they were able to then go back into their work and correct things otherwise they wouldn't have even known that they weren't going to get marks for, and really learning within the assessment. And so I think it was really beneficial for the students that they do appreciate that the process is there to help them and they are getting something from it, and then being able to reflect on a draft and apply the generic feedback to the final report was really good. In terms of their feedback and how we can improve it, one of the things that they asked for was for longer to do the draft and a shorter time for the final version. So they suggested to actually allow a week and a half for the draft and then half a week for the final version. A lot of the students didn't like predicting their own marks either. They found that put quite a lot of pressure on them, and that they sort of felt a little bit stressed out by that. So perhaps that's something that might be or could be removed. And they also asked for a lot more detail in the generic feedback and in the initial pro forma. So even though we had rewritten the pro forma and tailored that generic feedback quite specifically to the marks scheme, they still wanted a little bit more detail within that. And certainly for the staff marking it, I think one of the big changes that if we did, I would ask is for track changes in that final version, so that you can just really quickly see where the students have made those differences. We had to have two versions of the work open next to one another and just sort of scan through them to see whether where the changes have been made, and we're able to mark those changes. So to sum it up, I would say it's a work in progress. It's far from perfect, but I do think that the students appreciate the process, that they really engaged with it, and that they did see a benefit from it if they did engage with that. Just to say thank you to the people who were involved in that, the feedback workshops for students from Swansea University who graduated and then were doing either masters or PhDs, so Seb, Ross, Luke and Sean. And then with the flip feedback, Kat Sinclair was the technician who helped mark one of the reports. Owen Bodger is the stats guru who's helped me with all of the statistical analysis, and then Professor Naomi Winston from Surrey, who really helped encourage me to think about this as something that was worthwhile to continue with and to present. And I have promised Naomi I will write this up as a paper, and I do intend to honour that promise to her. So this will be coming out hopefully in the not too distant future. But thank you very much for your time, your attention. If you've got any questions or you'd like to get in touch afterwards, and those are my contact details, I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Nigel.